This lemon painting was so fun to do. So let's get into it. So the first step, I'm using this fine line masking fluid pen, and I get this from Opus Art Supplies. I will insert the link for you guys. My first step is to use the masking fluid to basically preserve the white of the lemons, and it is a small area to paint around. So in this case, I chose to use masking fluid. And I apply this to the intersections of the lemons. And if you don't have masking fluid, just try to leave some white areas unpainted when you do the painting. And masking fluid is essentially a liquid that, when applied to the paper, dries as a rubber, and it protects the white of the paper. It's pretty useful when you have complex shapes you'd like to preserve in white, and in situations it would just be difficult to paint around. I find that this is the easiest way to apply the masking fluid is with this fine tip pen. I've used other brands and other tools, mostly paintbrushes, which completely ruin the paintbrush. It just like dries as a rubber and it's useless afterwards. But yeah, I really love this pen. It works great for me. I'm using a pretty limited palette for this painting. I use a bright yellow and a kind of a spring green mixed with yellow to start. And so I apply the first layer directly to the dry paper, and this first lemon, I place more concentrated pigment at the bottom of this cut lemon. This will help with the shadowing effect that we will build up later. And I also add a first layer to the inner flesh of the lemon as well. The second lemon, I paint a layer of yellow, keeping some of the white of the rind on the inner skin untouched. And I also add a touch of green on the left corner. And I took this inspiration from a Pinterest photo I included with the extra resources. And you'll see me applying some salt for texture throughout this video. It applied really well to the orange that I add later in the video, but it didn't really interact with the yellow very much. So the salt to create texture really is dependent on each pigment. Some pigments don't react with the salt and others do. It's kind of a trial and error. Now, if you don't care for the splash effect that I add, you are more than welcome to skip this part. I wanted to experiment with kind of a looser feel to this painting. I'm usually very like hyper realistic, and it's hard for me to break away from that sometimes. So I wanted to try something different. And I start with adding a yellow splash effect, and I keep adding pigment and water until that splash is kind of running with the water. Like it gets very saturated and it wants to naturally drip. And you can try tipping the paper while you're adding the watercolor to see if it will run down the page. Then I use a stiff, bristly brush to add some splatter. A soft brush never works for this technique. It's got to be kind of a hard bristle that's very resistant to the flicking of your thumb or index finger. And the more watercolor you add on the brush, the larger the droplets will be generally. Next, I add the first layer to the third cut lemon. I leave the inner skin of the lemon white and add a thin line with yellow around the lemon to indicate that outer yellow skin. I then go in with the green and add it to the splash of the lemon while the paint is still wet. And I tilt the page of the watercolor so that it runs. And this was a new technique for me to try, so it took a little bit of trial and error. Then I add the second splash to the third lemon, trying the same technique of tilting the page and adding more and more water until it starts to kind of like run with gravity. I was really attempting to mimic what a natural splash might look like, adding both the yellow and the green together. And then I grab my stiff bristle brush and I add a little more splatter to this section, just flicking the brush with either my thumb or my index finger. Then I get to work on the main middle lemon there, keeping a highlight at the top of the lemon. I basically add as much more pigment to the bottom of the lemon, kind of where that shadow area would be. And I begin building that shadow area of the lemon. This is when I decided to mix up a yellow with a touch of orange to it. And I use this in the shadow area to give the lemon a little bit more depth and dimension. I wasn't really getting that with just the yellow itself. And then I add a splash to this lemon and add more orange to the shadow area. And I keep building up that color until I'm satisfied. I also go ahead and add that orange color that I just mixed up to the other lemons. I want to kind of dimension for them as well, mostly on the outer edge of the flesh of the lemons. And then I add some of the orange to the rind of the first lemon as well. Then I block in the leaf on the left-hand side with some of that spring green color, and then plus I mix a little bit of a darker green for some of the edges just to indicate some shadow. I add even more salt to the entire piece. I really wanted the salt to add texture to the outer rind of each of the lemons, and so I kept on just adding more and more to it. But like I said, the salt wasn't interacting with the yellow pigment, but once I added the orange, then it just started to do some magic. I block in the second leaf with the two greens. I decide that I wanted to add even more orange to the middle lemon. The thing with watercolor is that as the paint dries, it becomes lighter in color. And so that's when I always decide that I need to add more paint, is when it starts to dry and I'm like, oh, it's not dark enough. So once it starts drying, I basically notice it isn't dark enough, and hence why I keep adding layers throughout the whole process. Next, I use the bristle brush to add some more splatter. I go ahead and add a final splash to the first lemon using the yellow and green. You want to let this entire painting completely dry before you go and do peel off the masking fluid and rub off the salt. Otherwise, you run the risk of peeling the paper up when you go to peel the masking fluid. So I get impatient and I end up using a hair dryer to make sure it's bone dry. So once it's completely dry, I go ahead and peel off the masking fluid and kind of rub off the salt. These next steps are pretty optional. If you want to do them, by all means. So you can either use watercolor pencils or pencil crayons to add a little bit more detail. Occasionally, I use watercolor pencils for detail work because I have a bit more control. But you can paint in these details with a brush as well. Basically do this because when I take off the masking fluid, the edges can be a bit rough, and so I go over the painting with the watercolor pencils to basically smooth out the details. I also outline the rind and the leaves with the pencils as well. Next, I go in with the Dr. Martens bleed proof white watercolor / gouache. I'm not sure what it is. And I clean up the white areas as well. Like I said before, when you peel off the masking fluid, the edges can sometimes be a little rough. So I just like to go in with these white watercolor and just make them a bit smoother and more prominent, and kind of add sections of white that maybe I didn't really think about when I was masking. And because I really want to make this illustration pop, I also use a waterproof pen to outline the lemons and create a cool graphic look. You can do this with a regular pen, but be warned, if the painting gets wet after this, the pen will basically bleed all over the place. So I used two types of watercolor pens, and I will link them if anybody is interested. And I add the pen to basically the rinds and the intersections of the lemon, and I add little circle details and line details of the inner flesh of the lemon, and outline some of the splash details too. It was just really fun. I just kind of didn't think about it too much and just went with intuition and felt it out. And I had a lot of fun, like I said, doing this this painting. It was very loose, and I didn't worry too much about details. I just wanted to kind of make it fun. I might turn these into stickers, I'm not sure. And our next painting that I have up, I want to do a underwater scene with some orcas, like a mama and a baby orca. I think that would be really cool. I still have to work out this design a little bit, but in the next week or two, you'll see that coming up as well.